Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to Trump Watch. Well, the Iran war continues to go on. There's operating under a ceasefire, but the U.S. has just bombed Iran again. And so we don't know what the outcome of it is going to be. It's like I've said before, it's a tar baby for President Trump. He clearly thought this thing was going to be over in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or whatever. And he wants out. You can tell that clearly that he wants out of this war. And so they may reach some kind of a peace agreement. That's the indication so far. But we've had those indications from the president for quite some time now. So it's impossible to know. But I think one thing is certain is that they want out. He and the national security establishment want out of this tar baby because they're tied down. You know, as I pointed out in the previous Trump Watch, when you're holding somebody down, okay, they can't get up, but you can't get up either. You're as enslaved as they are, because the only way to keep them down is to stay there and hold them down. So this operation is clearly holding down the national security establishment. They've got this huge Navy armada to enforce this blockade, which is throwing the whole world into turmoil. I mean, it's really a double blockade. It's the Iranian blockade and the U.S. blockade that has effectively shut off 99% of the oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. But the Navy's tied down there. You see, they can't get up, because if they get up, then their blockade is over. And I think one of the reasons they went out of this thing is so they can move on to another regime change operation. I mean, this was their goal with this one, regime change operation, and it hasn't worked out. Now, President Trump says, well, yeah, it has, because we assassinated their top line group of leaders and maybe even their second line group of leaders, and that's regime change. Well, it isn't. A regime change, at least the way they want it, is where they get a U.S. puppet, a U.S. dictator, like the Shah of Iran. That's the kind of regime change they want, where the pro-U.S. dictator follows orders and does whatever he's told by the U.S. empire. But they want to move on. And I have absolutely no personal doubts that where they want to move on to is an invasion of Cuba. I mean, the national security establishment has long been obsessed with Cuba. And now that President Trump, in my opinion, has effectively been absorbed into the deep state that he decried, he's going along with it. They've wanted a regime change in there practically since the time that Fidel Castro took power and removed the pro-U.S. dictator, Fulgencio Batista, who the CIA and the NSA and the Pentagon absolutely loved. But the Cuban people didn't love this guy. He was a brutal, corrupt, horrific dictator. And I've mentioned in previous programs where this guy would send his goons out in the countryside to kidnap young girls, underage girls, bring them over to Havana, and then bring them to the hotels in Havana to serve as sexual perks for the mafia high rollers there, in the high rollers in the mafia-controlled casinos, and where Batista was getting paid off. So people did not like Batista in Cuba. And so they ousted him. They put Castro in, much to the chagrin of the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, U.S. officials, because Castro immediately said Cuba's going to be independent. We're not going to follow orders from the U.S. anymore. And this was anathema. They've never forgiven the Castro regime for doing that. Cuba was always supposed to be a puppet regime of the U.S., of the U.S. empire. And so that's why this obsession with Cuba. I mean, notice that they've let Vietnam go. I mean, North Vietnam killed, 56,000 of my generation? Total waste of life of people in my generation. And died for nothing, or sacrificed for nothing. But yet, normalized relations with Vietnam. Cold War is over. Cold War ended in 1989. And yet, here, this long-time obsession with Cuba. And that's what I think they're gearing up to do, is as soon as the Iran thing is over, they need people to forget about Iran immediately. You'll recall that after the U.S. got booted out of Afghanistan, U.S. forces got booted out of Afghanistan by the Taliban after 20 years of warfare. I mean, massive death and destruction, including among the Afghan people and Afghan forces and U.S. forces. Terrible death and destruction. And the U.S. gets booted out, so it was all the death and destruction was for naught. And what was the result? I mean, they immediately need a new crisis, and that was what the Ukraine war. Ukraine was just a proxy for the U.S., but they had moved NATO forces up to the border with Ukraine, and they were just ready to pull the trigger whenever they needed to. And so as soon as the Afghan operation is over, they don't want the American people to think about it and reflect on it and say, hey, my gosh, what was this all about? Maybe we ought to dismantle this national security state and its policy of foreign interventionism. Just don't give Americans any chance to reflect on this. Do some soul searching. Immediately pull the trigger, move to absorb NATO, to absorb Ukraine into NATO. And that, of course, precipitates and motivates the Russian invasion, which they knew was going to happen. You know, Biden says, oh, I've got intelligence saying this is going to happen. That's ridiculous. Russia said it was going to happen if you were going to prevent the absorption of Ukraine into NATO and U.S. nuclear weapons and German nuclear weapons and German forces right there on the border. Well, not German nuclear weapons, but Germany's part of NATO and the U.S. has nuclear weapons and so forth. Well, Russia was never going to allow that. But the important thing is that they distracted attention away from Afghanistan with this new proxy war, which is still going on. And that's what they're going to do here. They're going to try to erase any recollection of this disaster of Iran with an easy invasion. See, they need a victory now. They need a win. And I mean, the Cuban military is nothing. I mean, they haven't had oil in quite some time with this blockade. They've been hollowed out, just like Iran was hollowed out with decades of sanctions, this embargo. Very impoverished country, but they're going to make it look like, oh, this is a big military defeat, military victory, and they'll be passing out again the medals for heroism and, you know, badges and so forth that the military can put on their uniforms. But it's just a third world country. That's all it is. It's like invading Grenada or something like that and acting like this is a big deal. But they're building up to it. You can tell that they just issued a criminal indictment against Raul Castro, Fidel Castro's brother, for the shooting down of these planes. And they're saying that was an act of murder, an act of terrorism, and that Cuba's a supporter of terrorism. And so they're getting the indoctrination and propaganda machine geared up so Americans, especially the MAGA people, Make America Great Again, that they have something to hang their hats on. So instead of this being just a war of aggression against a country that has never attacked the United States or even threatened to do so, they're giving them something to hang their hats on. Say, oh no, but look, Jacob, look what they did. They murdered these guys in the planes back in the 1960s. Which very well may be true. I mean, there's no statute of limitations for murder. But it's really rich, though, that when they talk about murder, because if we're going to be indicting people, why don't we indict U.S. officials, too, at the same time? I mean, there is no question but that the CIA, which means CIA officials, the CIA is just, you know, an entity, but inside the CIA, there's real human beings who conspired to assassinate Fidel Castro. Well, that's murder. That's a conspiracy to murder. And that conspiracy took place right here on U.S. soil. And you can say, oh, conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory. You know, like when we bring up the national security establishment's assassination of President Kennedy. Conspiracy theory. But it's been fairly well established that they did conspire. Okay, there are conspiracies. And conspiracies to commit wrongdoing. And there was this conspiracy to assassinate Fidel Castro. Now, that's just murder, okay? Because there's no war between Cuba and the United States. The Cold War is not a real war. It occurred during the Cold War racket, you know, that had been going on since the end of World War II. So why not check and see if some of those CIA officials who engaged in that conspiracy are still alive? I mean, if Raul Castro's still alive, maybe they're alive. Well, let's indict them too for conspiracy to murder. Or, there's that downing of the airliner. What better act of terrorism than that? It was a Cuban airliner. It was leaving Venezuela. It was going to Cuba. It had all the young members of Cuba's fencing team. And a bomb blows up there, and clearly an act of terrorism, kills everybody. But you see, the mindset was, they're just all communists. They're just vermin. The mindset of the lives of the Cuban people was essentially, and is essentially, like the lives of the Vietnamese. They're all gooks. Okay, they're a little bit higher than the way people viewed slaves in the 19th century here in the United States, but not much higher. They're just gooks, and so no big deal. They bombed this plane. They're all communists. That was the attitude. But it's clearly an act of terrorism. Why not check and see who was involved in the CIA in that operation, if anyone? What would be the harm of indicting those people? But the whole history of U.S. actions toward Cuba has been one of state-sponsored terrorism. That's why it's so rich to see them accusing Cuba of supporting terrorism when it's the U.S. that has not only supported terrorism, it is the actor in terrorism. They had acts of terrorism throughout the Kennedy administration. That's what Operation Mongoose was all about. Go in there and make the economy scream. And they were, I think it was in the 1970s, maybe 80s, there were terrorist bombings of hotels, all CIA driven. I traveled to Cuba, and they have a museum, showing everything the CIA has done there in Cuba. And I went into the museum, and there was school kids. They have public schooling just like here in the United States, and it's all based on indoctrination, just like it is here in the United States. But their indoctrination is anti-CIA. The indoctrination here is pro-CIA. And so these kids were hearing the official story, but I was watching this thing, and I was thinking, they're all being told the truth here. These were acts of terrorism on the part of the CIA. But you see, U.S. officials don't see it like that. And MAGA people and other Americans don't see it that way. The U.S., no, Jacob, the U.S. empire, it does everything good. Well, it doesn't do everything. It's a ruthless, brutal empire. The invasion of Cuba, remember the invasion at the Bay of Pigs? This is a CIA operation. Okay, they were Cuban exiles, but they were proxies for the CIA. The CIA was training them. I think it was in Nicaragua or Honduras where they were training this group to invade, and then the CIA and President Kennedy were supposed to say, we don't have anything to do with this. They're just official lies. That's why you can't ever believe anything the CIA does, because their policy says we will lie if it's the interest of the national security, which means in the interest of the CIA. But they invade a country. They kill Cubans. We often think of the Cuban exiles that were captured and killed in this futile military invasion, paramilitary invasion. We don't think about the Cuban soldiers that were killed. Why not? They had a right to live. They had a right not to be invaded by their country. This was a pure war of aggression, pure invasion of a country that had never attacked the United States, under this notion that a communist regime in and of itself poses a threat to U.S. national security. It's ridiculous. This is what the whole Cold War racket was about. They convinced Americans at the end of World War II. They said, y'all have done a good job supporting us as we fought the Nazi regime, which was supposed to take over the world, even though it couldn't even cross the English Channel and conquer England. But it was going to conquer South America and work its way up. Yeah, sure, right. But now you can't rest, because now we got the Reds, the communists, which, ironically, the Soviet communists had been a partner of the U.S. empire during World War II. But now they've been converted into America's official enemy, which was Germany's official enemy too. Hitler hated communists too. And so there's the Cold War racket. And so we get converted to a national security state, and everything. The Reds are coming. The Reds are coming. The Reds are everywhere. They're in Hollywood. They're in the White House. They're in Congress. They're in the Army. And look under your bed. The Reds are there. And it was all a big racket. Just the Cold War was one great big national security state racket. And that was when the U.S. got converted to a national security state. That's why they don't have to comply with the Bill of Rights. That's why they are assassinating people on the high seas near Venezuela. They don't need to comply with the Bill of Rights because they know the Supreme Court won't enforce it on them. It's too powerful. The national security branch of the government, and it really is a separate branch, Pentagon, CIA, NSA, nobody can enforce judicial orders against them. The Supreme Court knows that. And what, they're going to take a team of marshals to a military base and say, we're here to cite the general for contempt? It ain't going to happen. And they're too powerful. They just put a team of soldiers there and say, thank you very much, you're ordered to get off this base. And so it's a practical thing. Once you convert to a national security state, you have omnipotent government, which is reflected by their power to assassinate. The national security establishment has full power to assassinate anyone it wants. I mean, that's what those assassinations on the high seas are all about. They use the drug war and so forth, but they're just as clear assassinations, and nobody's going to do anything about it. And especially since the Kennedy assassination, no president's going to buck them. Every president's going to go along with them, just like the Supreme Court goes along with them. But this invasion was part of this invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs was part of this mindset, and Kennedy fell for it. Kennedy admitted he fell for it. The CIA lied to him. There you go with lies. They said we won't need air support, and they knew they would need air support. But they figured that once the invasion got going, Kennedy, as the president, this new president, would have to send in the air support. He couldn't let these Cuban exiles fall to the communists. That would be too embarrassing, too much of a shame, too cowardly. And so they were manipulating him. And it didn't work because Kennedy said, no, I told you, no air support. And so he lets it go down to defeat. And that was the beginning of the battle, of the war between the national security state and Kennedy. And that was just the beginning shot. Kennedy said, I'm going to destroy the CIA. That's effectively what his words meant. I'm going to destroy the CIA, tear it into 1,000 pieces, scatter them to the winds. And the war was on because the CIA was very powerful by this time. Under the Eisenhower administration, Eisenhower was old. He essentially let the CIA have free rein to do whatever it wanted. And so it was a super powerful agency when Kennedy comes in, and Kennedy's going to destroy it. I mean, there was the first step in the war that would culminate on November 22nd, 1963. Oh, yep, I know. Conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory. But it was a ruthless war. But that invasion was an act of terrorism. I mean, to attack a country that has never attacked the United States, I mean, how else can you describe it? And then you've got this embargo. And I think it's worth mentioning that when Kennedy was assassinated on the very day, Cuba fits into this thing because he had an emissary in Havana having lunch with Fidel Castro with the intent of just ending the Cold War. He was negotiating with Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, and to end the Cold War and to move America into a totally different direction, and that which would have meant that the national security state would have been irrelevant. You wouldn't have needed him anymore because he was going to end this racket, and of course they had to get rid of him. Here's a president who's a threat to national security. But what's interesting is that assassination revolves a lot around Cuba. Kennedy here is going to, when they resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles there, the national security establishment went up in arms. Well, so did Kennedy, so did U.S. officials, even though they had a right to do so. I mean, it's a sovereign, independent country. They have a right to defend themselves. The mainstream press sometimes refers to them as offensive weapons. They weren't offensive. They were defensive. They weren't going to start a nuclear war with the U.S. They were just going to deter the United States, again, from invading Cuba. And so Kennedy strikes a deal and says, okay, I agree. We won't invade you again. Well, the Pentagon and the CIA went ballistic. I mean, this is their threat to national security. Here's a cowardly president who had backed down at the invasion and now permanently had left Cuba in communist hands, which they felt was the United States wasn't going to stand. The United States was going to fall to the communists. And then here's Kennedy saying, oh, it's going to get even worse for you boys, because now I'm making peace. We're going to end the Cold War racket. We're going to get along with the Soviets and the Chinese communists and the Vietnamese communists, and we're going to live in peaceful coexistence. And they couldn't let that stand, because it would have made the national security establishment irrelevant. And that's all covered in our book here at FFF. JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, why Kennedy was assassinated, by Douglas Horne, who served on the staff of the Assassination Records Review Board. And of course, there's my book on the Kennedy autopsy. That's how you know the military was involved, because of the fraudulent autopsy that they conducted on Kennedy's body on the very day of the assassination. And then there's my other book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story, that details the fraud that went into the Zapruder film of the assassination. So that's how you know when you look at the circumstantial evidence. But what's fascinating is that a lot of it revolves around Cuba, which we're still living under. Now, they put this embargo on, and that's an act of terrorism. I mean, it's like sanctions. It's no different from sanctions. What you're trying to do is kill the populace of the country with sanctions or embargoes Richard Nixon had a great term for this when they were doing the same in Chile 10 years after the Kennedy assassination, where he told the CIA, make the economy scream. Well, that means chaos and crisis where people are desperate, where they don't have food, where they're dying. And so that was the point of this embargo, and has always been the point of the embargo. Impoverish them so much. And now, the statists say, oh no, Jacob, it's their socialist system that causes their poverty. Well, it certainly is a factor. But people can figure out ways to get around socialist systems. There's always leakage there. People can survive. But the U.S. sanctions, the embargo, the blockade, just puts the squeeze on totally. It's like a vice. It just squeezes the lifeblood out of the people. And people are already dying in Cuba. They've essentially put a full blockade on oil. They have no oil. They have nothing. I mean, they're about to collapse. The regime is on the verge of collapsing, and there's on the verge of massive starvation. There's already deaths in hospitals and illnesses and so forth. And you can be guaranteed that the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, the National Security Branch, are so excited about this. They're loving it. I mean, they're absolutely loving it. This is what they've dreamed about, to be killing communists ever since Fidel Castro came into power. But it's all state-sponsored terrorism, you see, but they don't see it that way. And now if they invade and Cubans fight back and they're killed, they're going to be terrorists. The people fighting back will be the bad guys, even though they've just sat back. I mean, I remember what Che Guevara, who was, one of the allies of Fidel Castro, said. And at the very beginning, the press asked him, what do you want from the U.S.? And he says, just to be left alone. You see, the U.S. can't leave him alone because of this obsession. But when the invasion comes, it'll be the defenders who are the bad guys. Okay? And the invaders will be the good guys. I'll never forget, there was a guy named Ramzi Youssef. He was one of the plotters for the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. Now, clearly they were trying to bring down the World Trade Center back then too, but they didn't succeed. They caused some damage there, but they tracked the guy down. I think he was in Pakistan. They brought him back and tried him in federal district court, which is proper because terrorism is a federal criminal offense. But it was fascinating what he said. The judge was berating him. You're a terrorist and stuff. And this guy is fascinating. You can read what he said at sentencing online, or ask ChatGPT what he said. He was angry. And he said, you call me a terrorist? Look at you. Look what you've been killing children in Iraq with your sanctions. And they had been. They'd been killing multitudes of children. There's disputes on the numbers, but the purpose of the sanctions against Iraq was to get rid of Saddam Hussein throughout the 90s, and they were doing it by sanctions. Okay? Just like with Cuba. And when Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, was asked, are the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children really worth this regime change? Now, there's questions again whether it was really 500,000, but she didn't question the number because it was irrelevant. She says, yeah, it's worth it. I mean, this is what Ramzi Youssef was saying. You call me the terrorist. Look at you. You're the butchers. You're killing children. In other words, just because you've got a terrorist on one side doesn't mean that the other side is a good entity. You can have two evil entities battling each other. And this concept of terrorism is very interesting because I forget what year it was, but there was some another guy, I think he was from maybe Pakistan or some there, he was angry over all this killing and U.S. forces in the Middle East killing people and so forth and occupying the Middle East. And he said, his mindset, what are you doing over here on this side of the world? It's none of your business. You shouldn't be killing people over here. So he goes over to the street, the road that leads into CIA headquarters, and he starts killing people there in the cars as they're turning in. Clearly, they all work for the CIA, which is part of the national security establishment. It's all one great big military intelligence operation. Now, they don't wear uniforms, but it's all part of the same entity. It's sort of like the Gestapo wasn't wearing uniforms either, but it's all part of the national security state of Germany. Well, the CIA is part of the national security state of the U.S., even though they don't wear uniforms. So the CIA kills people. I mean, that's one of its main objectives is to assassinate. They have the power of assassination. They don't have to comply with the Fifth Amendment, like I said before, which prohibits the federal government from killing people without due process of law. But the CIA, once they converted the U.S. into a national security state, the CIA automatically acquired the power of assassination. So this guy was angry over that the CIA and the military was killing people over there. So he's retaliating against government officials. Now, he's not retaliating against innocent civilians, like the classic definition of terrorism. He's retaliating against the empire forces. But he's called a terrorist. Okay? So this is terrorism law in the empire. That the empire can go and kill people, but if those people retaliate and kill the killers, they're terrorists. And they're going to be raided and condemned, because when the empire kills people overseas, it's good, you see, because the empire is good. And you never want to question the empire, you see. National security, Jacob. They're killing people based on national security. But if they retaliate, it's terrorism, even though it's against the forces themselves, the national security state forces. The same principle in the USS Cole. Here you got a U.S. warship over, I think in Yemen or something, getting repaired or something. But part of this military force, empire force, that's over there killing people and occupying foreign lands and so forth. And so somebody attacks the ship itself. Now, there's no question that this is a military ship. But they caught the guys, did it, at least some of them, and accused them of being terrorists. Okay, so the warship can kill people over there, but if they fire back at the warship, they're terrorists. Okay, that's the law of terrorism under an empire. And not only that, but they're not going to try these guys in federal district court, because they established after 9/11 this dual system where the under military tribunal, they take them to Guantanamo Bay and they say, we'll try them over here under our system. Well, the reason they do that is because they're too afraid that some federal judge might throw out the charges and say, well, this is just an act of war. They don't want to take that chance, or that a jury could acquit. So you take them to Guantanamo, you're guaranteed a guilty verdict, you can give them a death penalty and execute them. That was why they set up that double judicial system. So there's so much hypocrisy here, and then let me just wrap this up by, they're saying that Cuba has a communist regime. They're really emphasizing that in the press now. Oh, it's ruled by a communist regime. It's ruled by a communist regime. Well, I ask, so what? Okay, so what? China's ruled by a communist regime. Vietnam's ruled by a communist regime. I mean, I'd be the last person in the world as a libertarian that would defend communism or socialism. But the U.S. empire is supporting a communist regime in Venezuela. Yeah, they're partnering with a socialist, communist, narco-terrorist regime in Venezuela. But because the narco-terrorist, communist, socialist regime there is now complying with U.S. orders and essentially has become a puppet regime, they're happy with it. And it's all based, it's fascinating because it's all based on central planning in Venezuela. Trump is the central planner in Venezuela, where he's centrally planning the oil production and how much revenues he will be permitted back to Venezuelan officials. The interim president has to submit this little budget like a kid. Can I have my allowance? This is what we need. Oh, yes, here we are. So the money's being funneled into the government. So it's a centrally planned system. But you see, communism is not bad in this case because communism is, the U.S. is managing the communist system in Venezuela. It's just pure hypocrisy. And that's what this whole policy toward Cuba has been from the very beginning. Just pure hypocrisy. It's horrific. And the people who have paid the price are the Venezuelan people. You know, I said earlier that I'd been to Cuba, and everybody was so nice to me. And I would ask people, I did ask people that, why are you so nice to me after what the U.S. government has done with this embargo that is put so much economic damage on y'all? And they said, well, what responsibility do you have for what your government does? And they were the nicest people. I've traveled widely in Latin America. The Cuban people are different. They're the nicest, most genuine people you would ever meet. The fact that they were killing people and trying to kill people with this embargo and this blockade and inflict massive harm on them is just horrific, because they are the nicest people, just collectively speaking, that I've ever seen. And what was interesting is that, you know, I was doing interviews in the street, and I was doing this with permission of the Cuban officials. I went over with a journalist visa, and I'd asked them, can I interview people on the street? Yes, you're free to do that. And what I found was that the average person hates the socialist system. I mean, they hate it. They know, you know, the world has left them behind with this system. But at the same token, they hate the U.S. government. I mean, you see, U.S. officials think that because they hate socialism, that they love the CIA. They hate the CIA. They hate the U.S. government. They love the American people. Now, that's why it's been a disaster with this embargo, because they put Americans into jail for traveling to Cuba and spending money there. In fact, they're just getting ready. They've subpoenaed Medea Benjamin, head of Pink something or other, for taking essentials into Cuba and trying to help people there. They're violating the sanctions. And this is not the first time. They went after a guy named Bert Sachs, an American from, I think, Seattle, that went to Iraq during the sanctions there with medicines and essentials, trying to help the Iraqi people. And they went after him with a vengeance. They fined him $10,000. They were like Ahab and Moby Dick, just would not leave this guy alone. And to Sachs's everlasting credit, many years went by and he never paid a dime of the $10,000. But now they're going after Benjamin and another guy that committed the dastardly sin of trying to help people who are starving to death because of the U.S. embargo. And so they hate the socialist system, but they hate the U.S. government. They love Americans. And the best thing you could ever do to help the Cuban people is lift the embargo and to let Americans flood in there, entrepreneurs, businessmen, and so forth. Does it mean that the Cuban regime stands? Oh, yeah, but it weakens the Cuban regime when wealth starts being built up in the private sector. But it's no business of the U.S. government. It's certainly no business of the national security state. Kennedy was right. End all this racketeering. He never called for he called for the abolition of the CIA, but what we need to do is dismantle the national security state form of governmental structure. We should never have adopted it. It's a totalitarian type system that characterizes Soviet regimes as too also. And and restore a limited government republic and stop this policy of foreign interventionism. Hopefully, this Iran thing will cause more Americans to do some soul searching and say, Jacob, you got a point here. This was a wrong direction that America took in terms of foreign interventionism, national security statism, imperialism, empire, and it's time to move this country back toward the sound founding principles of our country. We know there were some bad founding principles, but there were some good ones, and that's what we need to do, is get this country back on the right track toward those sound, positive founding principles. This is Trump Watch. Thank you all for tuning in, and as always, thank you for your great support of the Future of Freedom Foundation.